Hi everyone, this is Borgie, and I'm gonna explore the issue of bias in the media, kind of using a case study from this recent movie that came out, The Sound of Freedom, and the coverage of this movie in the media. So, Sound of Freedom, if you don't know, it's a story based on the life of Tim Ballard. Tim was a Department of Homeland Security agent who investigated child sex trafficking and child pornography crimes, and he quit his job, began a nonprofit organization to rescue children from sex trafficking. So that's the background of the story. Sound of Freedom purports to be a true story. It's based on a true sting that they did, and there's footage of the sting. There's been testimony to the House about the sting. There have also been confirmation from even some of the biased media coverage itself saying that he did work for Homeland Security, and also two of these articles I'm going to investigate a little today do also include that he served on a presidential task force advisory council to end human trafficking. So that's the background of this story, Sound of Freedom, and it stars Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, and who is also known to be a proponent of some QAnon theories. All right, so let's take a look at some of the coverage of this movie to see whether it's fair and what might the outcome of this kind of bias in the media be. So I don't expect a couple of these publications to be like really balanced, but a couple of them you would think they would. So let's just see what we've got here. So Rolling Stone magazine says, Sound of Freedom is a superhero movie for dads with brainworms. They call it a QAnon-tinged thriller about child trafficking, and they said it's designed to appeal to the conscience of a conspiracy-addled boomer. This is the first mention in this article that I'm going to point out of ageism. A lot of people consider boomer to be kind of an offensive ageist label here. So we've got one use of that. Along with that, this writer points to the reaction of an elderly man in the theater who says out loud that this is based on a true story, as the film always purports to be. And this goes into Jim's QAnon beliefs and says Ballard, Caviezel, and others of their ilk have primed the public to accept Sound of Freedom as a documentary rather than a delusion by fomenting moral panic for years over this grossly exaggerated epidemic of child sex trafficking. And back to the ageism again, Rolling Stone mentions the mostly white-haired audience that he sort of laughs at as they sit enthralled by this film. Now, is this a delusion? Does it involve QAnon conspiracy theories? Washington Post, which has a little bit more of a balanced article about this, says Sound of Freedom doesn't depict anything close to QAnon conspiracy fantasies. Rolling Stone goes on to characterize the film as fetishizing the torture of its child victims and lingering over lush preludes to their sexual abuse. This is interesting because Tim Ballard, in his interview with CBN, said that he refused to allow any depiction of child sex abuse in the film to avoid catering at all to pedophiles. And interestingly, The Guardian said that the film was disappointingly non-juicy. I'm not quite sure what they mean by that, but to characterize it as fetishizing the torture of its child victims is really, I think, a gross misrepresentation of what the film is trying to do. And let's check out the Washington Post. Washington Post article says that it is inspired by the real-life exploits of Tim Ballard, a former DHS agent who stages sting operations to catch child sex traffickers. And it does confirm, yes, he worked for Department of Homeland Security and sat on a State Department Advisory Council. Now, The Guardian talks about his employment at Homeland Security and says, or so he claims, and then follows it up with, the Department of Homeland Security can neither deny nor confirm this. So Guardian is casting shade on whether Tim Ballard even ever worked for Homeland Security. Pretty baseless accusation when it seems like all of the other media outlets, even that were negative toward the film, they apparently could uncover the fact that, yes, he did work for Homeland Security, along with the fact that he even sat on a presidential council. So the Guardian coverage of this says, this film is like Taken, but with a whiff of something noxious in the air. So the film has something noxious about it. And they kind of mock it this way. He says Ballard would still exude an angelic aura as he gently hoists dirty-faced moppets out of peril, as he utters the grave catchphrase, God's children are not for sale. I think it's interesting that they are so dismissive of the whole reality of child trafficking that they would kind of make a caricature of what the film is doing, just even the reference to the children that are, representing true child trafficking victims, calling them dirty-faced moppets that he hoists out of peril. I just don't think that kind of frivolity is appropriate for writing about this subject matter. Jezebel publication, of course, is extremely far left, and I wouldn't really ever expect anything they write to be fair or balanced. But they say this is a Sound of Freedom is an anti-child trafficking fantasy fit for QAnon. Again, this is reported to be a true story, but to them it's a fantasy. And kind of mocking again towards the film, he said, they write of Jim Caviezel when he tearfully recites, over 2 million children a year are being sucked into the deepest recesses of hell. I don't think that's really something to be talking about lightly, but somehow this article seems to be able to do that. And they do offer some qualifiers for the Jezebel article, which I appreciate, actually. They say exploitation of children is a real problem. Thank you. They do admit that Ballard has testified to the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee and that he did share actual footage of the sting operation portrayed in Sound of Freedom with the media, and that he did, in fact, work on the Advisory Council to End Human Trafficking. Thank you for admitting, some of what Ballard says is true. But in the end, they say, this was well acted. They do say it is well acted, but that the author of this article was bemused in quotes by the film, and says this is how propaganda works. Caviezel's shameless begging at the end underlines a desperation to disseminate. So crowdsourcing, I guess it's fine when other people do it, but not when nonprofit organizations that are maybe conservative or adjacent to conservative ideas. When they do it, it's not okay, and it's a desperate plea to disseminate their message instead of, crowdfunding, which you could just say it's crowdfunding, partially crowdfunded. And I think this is another really, really troubling line from the Jezebel article. It's just so dismissive of the problem. It calls this whole theme a voguish cultural anxiety. Human trafficking the issue is apparently a voguish cultural anxiety. We're gonna reduce it to that. So I want to just talk about the ramifications of some of this kind of, unfair, very biased reporting, and tell you that I have frequently scoffed at when people have said, when my friends who are more far right on the political spectrum than I am, which I'm a moderate, so I've never, in the last few elections, I haven't voted for a Democrat or a Republican, just haven't felt able to do that. And so I kind of have friends on both sides of this political aisle. And I have kind of scoffed when my friends who were farther right than me said, it's the mainstream media, they're so biased. The other day, my friend said, it's like reading the National Enquirer when you want to look at the news. And I thought, oh, she must believe, in really unfair media bias. And I have to say that I could see a lot of it in some of the terminology that is used to cover certain things. Among those terms, I would say that the gender affirming care term has caught my eye. We call, that's what they call, sex change operations now. It's called gender affirming care. Abortion is also called abortion care or health care. So even the way they term things is often biased in favor of their ideology, in favor of an ideology that not everybody agrees with. I can understand terms that want to, be inclusive, be affirming to people. I get that, but when you're talking about things such as even abortion rights, things that a strong percentage of the population does not believe are like guaranteed rights, you just need to find a way to talk about it that's a little more neutral, not always coming down on the side of one side of the spectrum's ideology and just terming everything in that way. And so this situation with film, it really highlights this and makes me listen a little more closely now, I think, when friends I have say, you just can't get any fair coverage for anything that aligns itself with like the conservative side of the political spectrum. I may listen a little more. So I think the consequences of this kind of reporting, and I'm absolutely certain that the right side of the political aisle does this too and is unfair at times for sure, but consequences of this kind of, coverage in the media, it really just polarizes our country more and more, and I don't think that's what we need at this time. Honestly, it's an interesting thing to do in a democracy because you can really stir up your own political base, the base of your side, the people who already agree with you. You can really get them going with these kind of articles, but I think it really just shoots oneself in the foot if they're wanting support for their causes. In a democracy, you need to sway people who don't agree with you over to your side, and this doesn't sway anyone. it doesn't sway anyone when it's just so blatantly negative and flinging out, you know, just baseless accusations out there. It doesn't bring anyone on the other side over to your opinion. It's not a way to persuade people. It's really just a way to get people more and more entrenched in whatever they already believe that is opposed to you. So it's a bad strategy. It's polarizing our country. In this case, I really think they have really managed to be pretty flippant and dismissive about child sex trafficking. And I was looking at the statistics for, you know, Department of Health and Human Services and the statistics for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, the UN report on human trafficking, which just says that this is involving tens of millions of people around the world, and about half of those had been trafficked for sexual exploitation. So these claims in these stories that just make it sound like, yeah, sex trafficking, it's not that big of a deal. This story of Ballard's is a fantasy somehow. It's so not aligned with reality. I mean, the line in one of the articles that said how it was grossly exaggerated and called an epidemic, as if it wasn't an epidemic. I don't know where these guys think they're coming from. I guess they want to either be willfully ignorant of what's really going on, or, you know, or they just don't care. Or it even brings to mind an article I read years ago about how, you know, when people view pornography, it actually was shown in this study to cause them to recommend less harsh sentencing or less harsh penalties for sexual offenders. Now, I don't know if that's part of what's going on here, that, you know, pornography is so prevalent in our culture that people are becoming desensitized even to some pretty terrible crimes. But I don't like their attitude, and I don't see what the benefit of this kind of reporting is. It's really dividing our country, and I think the side of this, the pro side of this argument, which says they have the right to report this way, is, of course, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of the press, and sometimes that's a rough balance to find, and they're entitled to their opinion, but I feel that there is a place of, you know, libel and slander are still real things that maybe people need to start pursuing more to stop, you know, these pretty outlandish and pretty unsubstantiated attacks on things and attacks on, you know, like a non-profit organization like Operation Underground Railroad that this film is based on. So I hope that as a society we can stop this polarization and this just really dishonest, gross mischaracterization of people we disagree with. The weird thing about this to me was that I thought, you know, who's gonna want to criticize a film that really is going to bat against child sex trafficking? Like, who disagrees about that's wrong, except the predators, you know? I think even the Jezebel article mentions that. So yeah, I believe as a justice issue, we need to have more fair, balanced media coverage of some of these issues and stop the polarization, stop the baseless, unfounded accusations and mischaracterization of our political opponents.